Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Christina Rose, Director of Strategic Alliances at Foundation Source, and I will be facilitating today's webinar, Disaster Philanthropy, a Starting Point. Before we get started, I want to first send best wishes to you, your families, and your communities. We are in the midst of a challenging time in the U.S. and around the world, and I know we are all seeking out ways to be of service. Today, I hope that we can provide some guidance on how philanthropy can provide assistance, not just in the current COVID-19 crisis, but in other global disasters as well. Our speakers today are Elizabeth Wong, Senior Philanthropic Director at Foundation Source, and Regine Webster, Vice President at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. I know this is a very busy time for you both, and I appreciate you being here. A few points to note before I turn it over to Elizabeth and Regine. A quick word about Wi-Fi and phone connections. Probably like most of you, we are presenting today's webinar remotely from our homes. Elizabeth is in Seattle, Washington, Regine is in Nashville, Tennessee, and I am in Fairfield, Connecticut, all regions currently under a stay-at-home order. We don't anticipate any technical issues during the broadcast, but if one of us loses connection, just know that we will quickly get it resolved and resume the webinar. If you experience problems, you can try exiting and then rejoining the broadcast. Also, audio may be better via phone than on your computer. It will also reduce some strain on your Wi-Fi connection. You can submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen. We will be monitoring this throughout and leaving some time at the end of today's presentation to address your questions. If we do not have time to answer all of your questions, please know we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. There are also two handouts attached to the dashboard as an additional resource, for you. One is on strategic philanthropy and another on getting to know Foundation Source if you would like to learn more about our work. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Wong is Senior Philanthropic Director at Foundation Source. In her role, she helps our private foundation clients accomplish their philanthropic goals in a variety of ways, including research, strategic planning, grant making and evaluations, governance, and family engagement. Elizabeth has over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. She was a founder of an independent philanthropic consulting firm and was a senior program officer at the Gates Foundation, where she managed a $90 million portfolio of special initiatives and family interest grants. She was vice president at JP Morgan Private Global Bank Foundations Group and also served as program manager at the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program and as a program officer at the New York-based United States-Japan Foundation. She began her career as a program coordinator with the Council on Foundations in Washington, D.C. Elizabeth, thank you for joining me today, and it's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to you.
Christy, thank you for getting us started. Good afternoon to the more than 400 participants who are joining us today. You represent a mix of existing foundations, individual philanthropists, financial and philanthropic advisors, nonprofits, and other professionals such as attorneys and accountants. Thank you for joining our webinar, Disaster Philanthropy, a Starting Point. Foundation Source is the leading provider of administrative services, online tools, and expert guidance for more than 1,600 private foundations. We are pleased to host this webinar in partnership with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. CDP focuses on when and how to give and helps donors align their priorities with innovative ways to meet the needs of vulnerable populations in the aftermath of disasters. With an emphasis on medium and long-term recovery, CDP works to increase the effectiveness of disaster-related giving, brings greater attention to the full life cycle of disasters, and provides disaster expertise to funders. Our guest today is Regine Webster. Regine was the founding executive director of CDP and is one of only a handful of people in the country who have managed a dedicated disaster response grant-making portfolio for a foundation. Regine is vice president of CDP and leads up their consulting and grant-making teams along with their educational initiatives. When we first scheduled this webinar, we did not know we would be where we are today. COVID-19 and social distancing were not household terms. We did not know that the nonprofit sector and the communities they support would be facing the combined impact of a pandemic and dramatic market volatility. But here we are. We wish all of you good health and hope that this discussion of disaster philanthropy fundamentals will provide a valuable basis for decisions your foundation will be making during this crisis and those we confront in the future. The state of play is changing daily, but Regina and I will do our best to set the stage for disaster philanthropy in general and discuss COVID-19 responses in particular. Regine, welcome.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Christy. I want to echo what Elizabeth just teed up, which is to say that this discussion is primarily, as the slide in front of you says, it's a discussion around disaster philanthropy, and it's a starting point into investigating where philanthropy can and should play a role in disasters. Again, as Elizabeth said, this discussion was teed up and planned and scheduled by us well in advance of COVID-19. We will truly do our best to weave into the conversation how COVID-19 and relating to a pandemic plays a part in disasters. And I also want to say, as Christy mentioned at the top here, each one of us is in a bit of a disaster hotspot. And here in Nashville, Tennessee, we began our month with a series of tornadoes that stripped across the north side of our town. And then we're ending the month with COVID-19. So it's been a bit of a rocky road, and discussion of disasters is no longer just part of my professional life. Rather, it's really part of all of the service work, all of the parenting, all of the friends, all of the networks that I circle in. So it's been an interesting month. But without further ado, let's dive into this starting point. So the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we were founded in 2010 with the desire to meet the needs of the private philanthropic sector so that they had information ready at their fingertips to understand when, where, how, and why to respond to disasters or in advance of disasters. We know from the South Asian tsunami, the Pakistan earthquake, Hurricane Katrina, and several other disasters, we know that these resources would pop up with lists and a bit of an overview of a particular disaster. And then those lists and information would go down and would move to the inside fold of the newspaper, leading philanthropy and leading the general public to believe that the disaster was done and that everything was okay. And that just absolutely isn't the case. And so one of our desires was really to bring forth the conversation and discussion around disaster risk reduction, resilience, and what does medium and long-term recovery really look like. We've got three buckets that we work in. The first is what we lovingly refer to as educate and inform. And that's what this is right now, right? It's the chance for Elizabeth and I to work together to put together a webinar talking about disasters. It also relates to the research that we do that I'll talk about in a moment, the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy report. We also have grant making and recovery funds. We do have a CDP COVID-19 response fund, along with several different named hurricane season funds and wildfire funds and global funds as well. And then lastly, as my colleagues over at Foundation Source do, we consult directly with foundations. We do that in a manner that, first and foremost, everything we do has disaster in the name, but we do that in a manner that gives us an opportunity to do really tailored work with foundations and corporations so that the strategy we develop with them is really theirs. Doing a quick pivot here to the current state of disasters. This is what 2019 looked like at least in the United States. So NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, puts together this map on an annual basis, drawing attention to the billion with a B dollar weather and climate disasters that get experienced. So certainly we all know how devastating the California and Alaska wildfires are, But until I saw this map, I was not sensitive to the fact that there was a hailstorm midsummer in Colorado. So this just provides a picture to what we all know and we experience through the media, through our grantees, through news outlets, but also what is unknown. So again, tornadoes and severe weather in October in Texas, unless you're in Texas and might already have known that. When I closed out the year in December 2019, I wrote a blog to our audience at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and I waxed prophetic, talking about the quiet time that we were looking forward to experiencing in January and February, and how that quiet blue sky time would allow us to be strategic and set our heads and our sights on what was to come in 2020. Well, clearly the joke was on me, because within a matter of minutes, within a matter of a heartbeat, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy was tracking and monitoring and connecting with individuals and organizations on the ground as it related to the Australia bushfires and the earthquakes in Puerto Rico. We're also very concerned with flood predictions for the Midwest in the United States, both up and down the Mississippi and Missouri River watershed. Given heavy flooding last year that really supersaturated the ground, coupled with a very wet winter, means a very wet spring and summer that's, like I said, really worrisome. Certainly, again, we're worried about the wildfire season. And I was just reading actually last night that several of the prescribed burns have been either temporarily or permanently stalled given the current COVID-19 crisis. And then here, of course, at the top of our list is COVID-19, something certainly that I did not have the ability to predict. But we are looking very carefully at pandemics from the past to see how we can learn from those past pandemics to influence and inform what we do in this future state. Turning now to looking at disasters and the big picture. We talked about the 2019 billion-dollar disasters, but you'll notice that the date just shifted here, and we're looking on this map at the 2017 billion-dollar weather disasters. And in a second, I'm going to refer to our research, but the reason for drawing this forward is that 2017 was the year of Harvey, Irma, Maria, terrible wildfires across Montana and California, earthquakes in Mexico, and several other disasters that reflected internally displaced persons and refugees. So we learned through our partnership with Candid, previously Foundation Center, that Hurricane Harvey drew forth, my WebEx screen is covering my numbers, that Hurricane Harvey from corporations and foundations raised upwards of $341 million. Meanwhile, Hurricane Maria raised only about a sixth of that amount at $62 million. And just reflecting on this data, we'll talk in a bit here about how many dollars have been raised for COVID-19. But we saw in 2017 a really sharp decline in corporate and foundation response. And Elizabeth and I, when we prepared for this conversation, we were ruminating on why that sharp decline. And what I believe, and I think Elizabeth would share this, and certainly my colleagues at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, is that there is a bigger population, in a bigger corporate and foundation population in Texas. There was a tremendous amount of attention around Harvey, and that there was indeed, I hate saying this, but there was indeed donor fatigue when it came to Hurricane Maria. Elizabeth, anything you want to add to that at all?
No, I really appreciate you addressing what some of the regional differences might be, and I think it's particularly helpful for our audience, which are truly national in scope, to recognize that their help can be needed, even though they may be 3,000 or 8,000 miles away if it's a global disaster. So I think this slide really helps us understand how the needs and the assistance can vary greatly.
We're going to talk to in a minute about household giving. And I think some of what we learned from household behavior has similar influencing behavior on foundations and corporations too. So that's my teaser to stay listening. So let's dive in a little bit more deeply into our financial analysis of 2017. So like I said, we work with Candid, and we, on an annual basis, put forth this Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy report, Data to Drive Decisions. And what we do is we track funding across a number of different sources, including foundations, corporations, individual giving, and then bilateral donors as well. So this slide shows you that in 2017, overwhelmingly, dollars were given to support natural disasters. So you can see that there were 3,370 transactions that we were able to track, with a total giving of $504 million that reflects both corporate as well as foundation giving around these natural disasters. And in contrast, you see that less than 1% of all dollars was given to man-made accidents. So when we as funders think about where can we put our dollars, where can we address need, those underattended disasters have a real need and a real place for those funder dollars. This one, this slide reflects philanthropic funding by disaster assistance strategy. So you can see we code by resilience, risk reduction, mitigation, preparedness, response and relief, reconstruction and recovery, kind of a blended multiple strategies, and then the unspecified and other. What was a bit unsettling for me is that between 2016 and 2017 data, we saw a real uptick in giving to response and relief, and a correlated downtick in giving for reconstruction and recovery. And we know that there are still people 2+ years, 2.5 years after Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We know that there are still individuals that are out of their homes. We know that there are still individuals living with, insecure access to electricity and water, sanitation, and hygiene. So I use this slide both as an information informative on understanding where funders are giving, but also as a charge to all of us to look not just at that immediate relief phase, but rather incorporating into our thinking and our funding planning, going past into that medium and long-term stage. And some would even say that 2.5 years after a disaster is still medium-term funding. Switching now here, you can look at where the dollars went. No surprise, I'm guessing, to all of you that 72% of all dollars went to North America, and in contrast, a paltry 3% went over to Africa. If any of you are able to add really quickly, you'll notice that this adds up to over 100%. It's because some of the grants funded multiple regions. So this, again, I mentioned the different sources that we track with the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy. So here again, you can see OEC, the Development Assistance Committee, other bilaterals, FEMA, HUD. You can see institutional philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, and several of our other partners. And Elizabeth, I think that you had a question that you wanted to pose about this data here.
Yeah, this slide is quite stunning in some ways. It shows us billions of dollars in government support. Can you help us understand why this isn't enough to help rebuild a single community or repair the telecommunications system of an island? It is so much more than what individuals and private foundations can offer.
Absolutely. And we talk about the tapestry of funding that is needed to rebuild a community. Regrettably, when you talk about electricity on Puerto Rico, is what I'm guessing you were referring to, Elizabeth. Regrettably, the island of Puerto Rico had vast amounts of debt. If I'm not mistaken, it was 70 billion with a B in debt in advance of Hurricane Maria. plus a very weak and insecure infrastructure. And so to repair that is just so incredibly costly and far exceeds the $504 million that came through from private philanthropy. So to us, it's about, what can philanthropy do to spring loose additional funding? What can philanthropy do to be that golden ticket of flexible and unfettered funding to an organization working to support, the implementation of a solar project? So thinking about it as a tapestry, as a puzzle, as a quilt, whatever you want to call it, it really does take this variety of funding sources to get to any kind of recovery. I do really quick want to draw your attention to this bottom right corner where you see HUD funding. And you see HUD funding at $2.7 billion, which is considerably less than FEMA funding. HUD funding trails far later. So I would expect the 2018 or even the 2019 measuring the state of disaster philanthropy to see that HUD number increase exponentially. Maybe not exponentially, increase a lot. Okay, this slide, I know that this is a little teeny to everybody who's watching this, but what it shows, this is the way that we can reflect our longitudinal data. We see that year over year, the amount of funding was highest both in 2014 as well as in 2017. The number of grants was highest in 2017, again, given Harvey, Irma, Maria, wildfires, Mexico earthquake. And the number of foundations who found themselves participating in disaster philanthropy increased considerably as well. I'm going to, I think, swiftly move off of discussion of the data, but I want to point you all in the direction of an online tool that we have with Candid, which is our mapping platform. And it's so informative. I didn't create it, so I can brag on it. It is so informative. If you were to go now, let me say how informative it is. The Candid team is updating the COVID-19 donations on a weekly, if not more frequently basis. So if you were to go into this mapping platform and in the search bar type in COVID-19, you would be able to see who the funders are, where they have funded, and what they have funded for. And so in this time of seeking knowledge, seeking understanding, this mapping platform, in my view, couldn't be more helpful. I'm going to go quickly on this next couple of slides to make sure that we do have time to speak about COVID-19. With Candid and with the Indiana University School of Philanthropy, we conducted a survey of households to understand their giving in both 2017 and 2018. So to remind us again about the events, we're talking wildfires, Harvey, Irma, Maria, Michael, Florence, and I'm missing one. I know I am. Oh, it'll come to me. And what we learned is that in 2017 and 2018, basically 30% of all households donated to disasters. And we found that to be really impressive. 14% gave to Harvey, 8% gave to Maria, 6% gave to Irma, and in 2017, and then in 18, 11% gave to the wildfires, 9% gave to Hurricane Michael, and 8% gave to Hurricane Florence. The mean donation was between $100 and $500, which is pretty impressive and incredibly generous. And so we believe that somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion were donated by households to disasters each year. Here's the takeaway that I personally love, and I think reflects back to that question, Elizabeth, that you and I were talking about. There's three reasons that we ascertained why households give. First is just the scale of the disaster and the number of people affected. So Harvey was a huge disaster. Maria was a huge disaster. The other piece is that connection to place, right? Like, oh, I grew up in Texas, or I am Puerto Rican, or, oh, my family has another home in Florida. And then lastly, we know that media coverage of a disaster has an overwhelming impact. So my new joke that I like to say is that Anderson Cooper is far and away the best fundraiser that any disaster serving organization has, because that media is such an important thing. Turning now to some of the key takeaways that we have about private foundations and their role in disasters. Again, private funders, you all are so incredibly important to that quilt, to that puzzle of funding, both for domestic and international disasters. You also have the ability to structure your funding in a way that, bridges that gap between immediate relief and long-term recovery. And you have expertise around recovery strategies that can really be brought to bear. A couple of resources that I want to mention here about disasters in general, and Elizabeth and I will reference some COVID-19 resources in a minute here too. You heard me talk at length about the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy report. We also have our Disaster Philanthropy playbook that provides tools and tips for the funding community to respond to disasters. Primarily, I would say the primary audience is for place-based givers, but it's relevant to all donors as well. We have that household disaster giving report here for your review. And since again, I kind of whipped through that quite quickly. And then our website is tracking not just COVID-19, but certainly the bushfires, the Puerto Rico earthquakes, the Midwest flooding situations, and several other disasters as well, both domestic and global. So I'm gonna stop and turn. I'm gonna stop talking and I'm gonna turn the conversation over to Elizabeth.
Regine, thank you so much. This has been an incredible wealth of information, and a couple of questions come to mind. With both domestic and global disasters, there's a core group of first response agencies that are consistently on the ground. Red Cross, Save the Children, CARE, IRC, and the like. What would you recommend if a private foundation wants to work with an organization that is based in the community where the disaster occurs? What are some key considerations that they might factor in selecting an organization for recovery work?
Yeah, for me, there's two factors that come top of mind with that question. First is this. Be planful and mindful about how you're going to respond to a disaster in advance of a disaster. Disaster people have this corny little moniker that they say, which is the wrong time to exchange a business card is in the middle of a disaster. So that leads into my second point that rises to the top for me, which is to say, each one of you funders on the line right now have a particular mission and have a particular focus. So if it's arts and culture, then make a connection with a disaster serving organization that focuses on arts and culture. If your typical focus is water, sanitation, hygiene, then partner in advance of a disaster with an organization that has a focus on water, sanitation, and hygiene. That way, you are continuing to lift up your own institutional mission at the same time as really making available to any organization the expertise that you already have in-house. So that way, if you follow my two little rules of thumb here, that means that you'll already know who to call if a disaster event occurs, and you'll already know what to do.
That's really helpful. I want to take us back to a question. We didn't have a time to talk about it today, but Regine, you and I have talked in the past about the pattern of giving immediately following a disaster, sort of when giving from the public may peak and when government funding may begin to flow. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when the two different audiences that I'll speak to, when you're talking about the general public and their donation cycle, the peak day of giving is day 4 after an event. And that completely directly correlates with the day of peak media attention. So you can say that 4 days after the Nashville tornadoes was most assuredly the day of peak giving to the Nashville tornadoes. And then again, among the general public, there's this really precipitous drop off. If you're thinking about it, the shape of a bell curve, there's this precipitous drop off over the course of the next couple of weeks. We know that somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/3 to 50% of all giving occurs in the first 2 months. And now I'm not just speaking about the general public, I'm speaking about donors of all types. So that's 1/3 to 50% of all giving is complete within the first 2 months. We know that by the 6-month mark that all giving is complete, and that there are very few new entrants into the funder space after that 6-month mark. And so that's certainly something that we are working diligently to try to change, to shift that curve out, to ensure that there's those disaster dollars available for organizations working on the ground long after the event hits and long after that 6-month mark.
And you've mentioned before that in HUD dollars, for example, do take longer to start to flow. So it sounds like there's quite a big period of time between 6 months when the majority of public dollars stop, and 8 to 18 months perhaps when government dollars start to flow, where private funders can have a major impact on helping to bridge some of those services and needs.
Absolutely. And I don't know if now is the right time to talk about this, Elizabeth, or not, but we are seeing the nonprofit social service sector be just incredibly hard hit right now. I know you're in Seattle, Elizabeth, and I'm here in Nashville, and events are being canceled left and right for the first time in ever. Neither my husband nor I have any work travel scheduled. And that has devastating implications on the nonprofit sector, their ability to fundraise, their ability to mobilize volunteers, their ability to bring people into their spaces. It's incredibly challenging for them. And so having a funder willing to be, like we talked about earlier, to be that bridge between this unknown period and a period when federal funds might knock wood, begin to flow, is really a valuable place for the funding community to be.
That's great, Regine. I appreciate that. And maybe this is a good time, Christy, to turn it over to you to share with us some of the questions that we're getting, and Regine and I would be happy to respond to those, and we are certainly prepared to move toward addressing and relating how all of this is pertinent with COVID-19.
Great. Well, thank you both. We have received a number of questions, and I appreciate everyone's engagement for the first half of today's webinar. The first question, Regine, that has been asked a number of times is if attendees could possibly have access to your slides beyond today's webinar. I think folks find the information very valuable.
Oh, totally. Absolutely.
Okay, great.
I will PDF this so that you don't see my little crib notes at the bottom and get that to you in a list.
Okay, wonderful. And then we'll send that out to everyone who is on today's call. So jumping into some of the questions that we had, one came in that a wide array of funding strategies were mentioned, but what about donating things such as canned goods, blankets, stuffed animals, masks, etc.?
I'll take the first stab at that and offer two thoughts. First thought is that oftentimes the donations of gifts in kind are referred to as the second disaster. That is to say that communities get overwhelmed with these gift in kinds and the donations that come that sometimes, if not oftentimes, have little relevance to the actual needs on the ground. For instance, and now this is an old story, so I'll come up with a newer one. But an entire container ship, or not a container ship, excuse me, an entire container was shipped to Indonesia, and it was filled with all left shoes. So that then becomes something that a port authority has to deal with, and then somebody has to deal with the disposal of this entire container. We know currently that there are, that there are people who are. I'll give a Nashville example. The Community Resource Center here in Nashville very specifically said they were not accepting donations of clothing, because what happens is that you end up getting bathing suits when it's actually March, or you get sandals when it's March, or you get mismatched socks or whatnot. So my second point is to say donations of goods are acceptable if they are requested. And, Elizabeth, I should let you say this, but if they are requested, if they are new, if they are high quality, if they are of a quantity that can be useful to a particular organization or community, then they are acceptable. Elizabeth, do you want to tag on with me?
Sure. I think that in the COVID-19 situation in particular, there's so much discussion about donating masks or even making them by hand. I think we have to all recognize that hospitals must have manufacturer grade sterile masks in their original and unopened packages at sufficient volume to justify the logistical burden that accepting such donations requires. For example, a minimum of a pallet of cartons of masks. And I think that there is some confusion around and a real desire on the part of individuals to say, what can I do? I want to go to my garage and find what I can to help. And I think what we're identifying is that there is a disconnect in the needs of healthcare workers and what we can all produce out of our garages. But what's important, I think, here is that private foundations can play a role in, for example, helping to support intermediary nonprofits that are really serving that logistical bridge between first responders and healthcare workers, for example, in need, and the provision of volume manufacturer grade sterile equipment, those kinds of things. Christy, do you have any others for us?
Oh, yes. So another one. Earlier, we talked about disasters that affect one geography or a particular community. COVID-19 does not discriminate and has affected nonprofit organizations all over the world. What are some things that foundations can do in the face of this particular crisis?
Christy, this cannot be more true. In many ways, no organization will be exempt from the effects of this pandemic and the market changes. And in this sense, every foundation can take steps to have a significant impact on their grantees. We have seen a variety of creative responses at Foundation Source, and I'm sure the Center for Disaster Philanthropy has as well. First and foremost, ask your grantees and trust them. They know best what their needs and the needs of their clients and communities are. Convert current project grants to general operating support grants. Just as Regine mentioned at the top of the webinar, we don't want to lock people in with the way that they can spend dollars. Extend current funding by 1 year or a fixed amount to reduce the administrative burden. Lower or remove reporting requirements. Provide additional funding to address income loss that results from canceled fundraisers and fewer donations from individuals. Provide financial expertise in the form of consultants who can help grassroots organizations develop new business plans to address urgent liquidity needs. We have funders that have asked their grantees, what is your burn rate? How much cash do you have, and how long can you keep the doors open? And in some cases, their grantees don't know the answers to that. They need fundamental planning, financial planning help. Purchase 1-year subscriptions to online meeting services that enable nonprofit staff to work from home and continue to be productive and provide services to their communities. Look for secondary and tertiary effects of closures and work with nonprofits to develop mitigation plans. If food trucks are going to see less business and have to lay off workers, where do those workers live, and what communities are gonna need increased services? What about maybe job training organizations that can help laid off hourly workers tap into sectors that are experiencing higher demands, like grocery stores? Regine, do you want to add any to that list?
Yeah, mine isn't as sophisticated as Elizabeth, but it's to talk about compassion. Now more than ever is the time to exercise compassion with your grantees. Call them, check in with them, ask how they're doing, ask how their clients are doing, ask how their staff are doing. Unrestrict as much funding as you can possibly restrict. Anything that falls under the header of compassion is what we should be doing right now.
Well, that leads us directly into the next question that came through about when a public charity has to suspend or delay programs due to a disaster. How long should a funder continue to provide grant support or allow delays in program delivery? And have you heard about any other funders and how they're handling this?
I think
Christy, thank you.
Funder.
Oh, go ahead, Regina.
Do you want to go? No, you go.
I was just going to say, financial planning is becoming a focal point for funder and grantee alike. Foundations are experiencing shifts in their portfolios and wondering what to do. Some are deciding to make grants now, when grantee partners are experiencing their greatest need, and applying any surplus distributions to next year's minimum distribution requirement, which in the current financial environment may be lower because of fluctuating assets. Others are viewing their response in a few different phases, 1 to 4 weeks, 3 to 6 months, and thereafter, and are actively reviewing their next steps at each juncture. This might involve a handful of immediate but short-term commitments, and then in the first few weeks, and then lead to more complex grants in subsequent months. Over to you, Regine.
I was just going to say, I'm seeing that happen locally, where the local funder community is getting in touch with local grantees and communicating about what this planning looks like, just as Elizabeth said about the financial planning element of it. Back again to what I said about fundraisers falling off the books, we also have heard reports that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of all restaurants are going to close. And if we use that figure as any sort of a proxy number for what's going to happen with the types of organizations that all of us on this call fund, then we're in deep trouble. And so we do need to exercise that planning, exercise that communication, and give as sacrificially as we can to these organizations that really are in jeopardy.
Great, thank you both. And I know that these are questions that we're fielding from our private foundation clients every day, as I'm sure you are at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. So I would also just jump in and say, if you have specific grantees or organizations that you are currently working with and you need some resources and discussion, I would encourage you to reach out to your contacts for both Foundation Source and CDP. Another question came in that during a crisis or disaster such as COVID-19, where can an individual or foundation find resources about organizations to fund both in their local communities and nationally as well?
Elizabeth, do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
Oh, I was just going to say, both Foundation Source and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy have been endeavoring to post resources on this question on their websites. So that's a good place to start. And you can also go to your regional association of grant makers. They too are pulling together information as quickly as they can around their local communities.
I'll add 2 more sources. One is Candid, and again, Candid, formerly GuideStar, they merged with Foundation Center, not Source, and they have been doing a really tremendous job of tracking the donors that are allocating their resources to COVID. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if I'm going to mess up my screen share here, but I'm going to, there are upwards of $2.7 billion with a B dollars that have been directed to COVID-19 globally. The South Korean corporations like LG and Kia have really stepped up to the plate and provided tremendous funding support to the Asia Pac region. So Candid is a great resource to look at to understand, again, that who's giving what, when, where, and how. And we also actually right now are hosting a webinar over on the Center for Disaster Philanthropy platform that looks at, that is looking at what we can learn from past pandemics to predict future solutions. And so if you go onto our website, disasterphilanthropy.org, either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, you can listen to that webinar as well and see what we can learn from like SARS, H1N1, the AIDS pandemic, Ebola, etc.
Great, thank you. This kind of gets to the pain that, communities, individuals are feeling right now, but in the face of layoffs and reduction in services for families, can foundations support individuals?
When an emergency is declared, the IRS suspends some of the limitations it places on private foundations, and grants to individuals is one of those areas. Foundation Source will actually be offering a webinar dedicated specifically to grants to individuals in the coming weeks, and we'll be sure to get that information to the audience on this webinar. There are interesting opportunities for all private foundations in the time of emergency.
Great, thank you. And I did have a couple of follow-up questions in addition to that about kind of limit to how much you can give to individuals. And I don't want to take us too far off topic, but do you want to just address that quickly?
The IRS does establish a limit of up to $5,000 per household.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And bear with me for one moment as I look for some, through all the additional questions. We have a lot of presentation, a lot of active participation. So it's great to see, but it just takes a moment for me to get through all this. Another question that came through is, if a small private foundation does not have any disaster response planning in place, what can be done in the middle of a disaster? Do you have any ideas how to help local frontline health workers, kind of as an add-on to that as well, for foundation planning?
I think that might be
Jane,
you,
do you want
Elizabeth?
to start? Sure, I'm happy to start there. I think, one thing that's really interesting or challenging about the COVID-19 crisis is that it is, as we've indicated throughout this conversation, affecting all of us, every person, every funder, and every nonprofit organization. And one of the things that we are seeing is that nonprofit organizations are going to struggle to survive. So even if a funder does not necessarily have a disaster portfolio in place, or they don't work with health workers or in the health field in a typical given year, those are not part of their program priorities. Continuing to support the important work that they are doing every day in their communities, in their own areas of expertise, continuing to work with their partner nonprofits is an incredibly critical response to this crisis, and often to many others that are as prolific as this one is.
Right, and I know our private client advisors who work with our current foundations, this is the most commonly asked question that has come up in the past couple of weeks. They're looking for ways to respond, be of service and support. So I know we have a lot of clients on the phone today, and I would just say we're still here to help, and hopefully some of the additional resources the things we talked about today will continue to inform the strategic philanthropic work on how you're responding right now in the coming weeks. So, I guess hopefully we have given you a fairly broad range of tools to turn to. Another question that came through, and I think we'll just have two more, and then wrap everything up. I know everyone's time is precious right now. How do we balance between giving to larger organizations with a greater scope, such as the CDC and the Red Cross, versus more specifically directed smaller organizations?
I mean, that's a difficult question, and I think it goes back to those 2 points that I had made earlier. Is, to the extent that you can work with existing partners, existing grantees, and to the extent that you can marry any donation to your existing mission, that's what I would certainly prioritize. If indeed you have an interest in scientific evolution and revolution, then absolutely supporting WHO and the CDC Foundation make a tremendous amount of sense. In addition to that, if you have an interest in supporting, prevention of the spread to, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, Central and South Africa, then supporting either international NGOs or, again, those, the UN Foundation is certainly a strong place to go. I'll also say that the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we have a CDP COVID-19 response fund where we're both looking domestically and internationally. But again, do what you can to bring your own mission-based expertise to this conversation.
I would echo that, Christy, and just say that in addition to considering what our nonprofit partners can handle and manage at this time and what their greatest needs might be, I think funder capacity is another question. Funders are dealing with changes in the market which are affecting their ability to give, and there are times when I think it makes a lot of sense for them to go to a joint or pooled fund or to a partner like the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, which has a fund. And people ask us, well, how do we know if it's a good thing to give to contribute to that fund? Certainly, reputation matters. I think that you can ask questions such as how much of these dollars will be getting out the door and reaching the designated audiences. You can ask about who is on the grants committee or the advisory committee that's helping to direct the dollars of that fund and understand what their expertise is. And I think that our foundations will find that there's an incredible range, and you can likely find a fund that has expertise that your particular board may not have. And I think in that case, that kind of contribution may make sense, coupled with the continuing to support the grantee partners that you already have and that you know best.
Great, thank you. And I'll make this our last question, and it is a little bit more specific to private foundations, but I think it is an important one that was a question that was posed. And that relates to the minimum distribution requirement for private foundations. This person asked, obviously, we try to stay at the 5% distribution in the interest of perpetuity. What is your recommendation for exceeding that? I can't think of a better time if we were to dip into our principle. So, Elizabeth, this is probably one you field quite a bit, so I'll throw that to you.
Sure, I'm happy to talk this through. We talk about perpetuity and a foundation's ability to continue to be able to help nonprofits who are working in priority communities. I think at times like this, and I'll specifically talk about COVID-19 market volatility, nonprofit organizations in many cases are not even contemplating perpetuity. They're contemplating this month, next month, 6 months from now. And in turn, the communities that they are supporting are facing equally dire conditions and dire circumstances. So I think one of the really difficult things is when foundations are looking at their portfolios and seeing decreases. It can lead to a sense of discomfort, certainly, but their ability to manage complex financial changes is much, much greater than their nonprofit partners' ability to manage even 1 to 3 months of unstable income flow. So I would say that first and foremost, that we take a close look at the impact that all of this is having on our nonprofit partners, some of whom are very grassroots. They are doing what they do best and working on a person-to-person basis on the ground, and they really could use all of our help in staying afloat. I think, though, that it's still important to talk about long-term financial management for a foundation, and certainly private foundations can give above and beyond their minimum distribution requirement and have that surplus amount applied as a carry forward to future minimum distribution requirement years. And in fact, doing that this year and doing that now might make a lot of sense. It might put you into a good sort of credit position for next year when the minimum distribution requirement will be lower if your assets are lower now, and it might be a kind of financial recovery year for you as a funder.
Thank you. I appreciate your information on that. And I just want to, in closing, thank you both again, Regine, Webster. We really appreciate you joining us today and lending your expertise and experience, and Elizabeth, you as well. As a last bit of information for everyone on the line today, I would encourage you, if you have questions, if you're interested in starting a private foundation, if you are an existing foundation and you are looking for access to resources, I'm going to give you my phone and email in a moment. Please feel free to reach out to me with questions. Regine, I did have some specific questions that came through about CDP and your response fund right now, so I'm going to forward those to you as well. And just, want to wish everyone the best as we go forward in this uncertain time. I think it is encouraging how philanthropy responds in these moments. And as a last takeaway, beyond the call, everyone will receive a link to today's rebroadcast of the webinar, and you will also receive an email once we have finalized the date for our Grants to Individuals webinar in April. It will also be posted on our website. My email address is crose, R-O-S-E, @foundationsource.com. And my direct phone number is 203-292-4278. Please feel free to field questions to me and I can get them to the appropriate person. That concludes today's presentation, and I just lastly want to wish everyone the very best and your communities as well. Thank you all so very much.